Good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Bradley. I'm the Executive Director of your Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society. Thank you for joining us in person and on Zoom today. I wanted to begin tonight by... Ooh, we are getting feedback. Is that better? Yeah. We're going to take a 1-minute pause while I go turn off a speaker. All right, take 2 for the video recording. I'm going to wave my arm so I can see it when I do the editing. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Bradley. I'm the Executive Director of your Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society. Thank you for joining us, and definitely a thank you to those joining us on Zoom. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging the original custodians of this land and for paying our respects to the elders, past, present, and future. For they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of Indigenous peoples. We also recognize that we are meeting on the traditional land of Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850, and to acknowledge the role of the Métis settlement in the development of our community. Bit of housekeeping, if you have not been to the museum in a while, there is a restroom just outside of this room on the right towards the elevator. If that is occupied, there's another set down on the second floor as well. This lecture is being recorded tonight, and for those joining online, we cannot see or hear you. For those in the room, if you have any cell phones or music players, record players, please do silence those at this time. There are refreshments available, so please do help yourself at any time. And there will be some time at the end for questions and answers. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by Lakehead University's Department of History. I would like to also recognize some distinguished attendees to tonight's lecture. Please stand or give a wave or a woo, and I apologize if I miss anyone or butcher your name. So joining us tonight is Peter Boyle, retired former Executive Director of Magnus Theatre and Manager and Marketing and Visitor Experience at Fort William Historical Park, and also most recently recognized by the Ontario Museum Association's Distinguished Career Award. So welcome, Peter Boyle. He's sneering at me for all the attention. Also joining us tonight is former president of the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society, Mark Chakla. And there he is. So tonight's speaker is Gérard Boyer, a retired teacher principal who spends much of his time researching and writing about his ancestors in Canada. He is originally from the Lower Ottawa Valley, a member of the French-Canadian Genealogical Society in Montreal, and trained in the transcription of old French documents. He has organized extended family genealogical trips to Acadia, otherwise known as Annapolis Royal, twice to France and to Scotland. So without any further ado, welcome, Gérard Boyer.
Does that sound? Can everyone hear me with this? So I did this presentation in French on Sunday without a mic because I have a loud voice, but I'll use the mic because apparently it's better. So I've been introduced. I'm an amateur with a lot of experience in the field of genealogy and history, always had a passion for history. And I should be living in the Lower Ottawa Valley because that's where I should be, but I happen to be in Thunder Bay, and I've been here for 10 years now. And enough things have popped up to tweak my curiosity. So I finally got to walk the Grand Portage Trail 3 months ago. I did it in 2 stages because I'm too old to do the whole thing and come back. And I'm a member of the Thunder Bay Hiking Club, and it's not one that you'd ever do with the club because it's boring. It's a natural sidewalk through the bush. That's what impressed me, is I was curious about what the trail was all about. And I was just shocked at the fact that you start off and you pretty well walk over the shield, and it kind of goes like this, but there's no high areas, there's no low areas. and you get to the Pigeon River where there used to be a fort or a post. So if you ever want an easy walk, and if you want to split it in half, I did it to the old Highway 61 and then came back. And then the next time we did it last winter and didn't realize that the road wasn't plowed, but the conditions were good enough in February that we could get to where the path was. And after we were done the hike and came back, we were stopped by a border agent in a truck wondering what we were doing there. And we just said we did the last part of the Grand Portage trail. So anyway, and you would say Grand Portage. So I'm torn. Sometimes I say things in French, sometimes I say them in English. You'll just have to forgive me. You call it Ile Royal and I call it Ile Royale. And just like I'll say Grand Portage, you'll say Grand Portage. So if at all you need an explanation, I'll do that. I don't expect my presentation to last too long. It was 45 minutes the other day, and that was in French. So usually we talk a lot more than I do in English. So it could be even shorter than that tonight. This is called the early French history of Thunder Bay, but I mean, I didn't know what else to call it. It's while the French were here at the behest of the Ojibway. So in other words, although the King of France thought he had these huge tracts of land in North America, he never ran or administered this part. So I want to make it very clear as I do this presentation, although the French in France laid claim here, the voyageurs knew what was going on. They were here to make money, and they couldn't make money without the very helpful support of the Ojibway, who I hope at that time that it was a mutual exchange. Other than the diseases that were brought, I think for some of that period it was a beneficial exchange, but there's no two ways about it. This was Ojibway country. So I want to make that very clear. Conveniently, I was able to do it this way because the French were here. They were the ones who were making the contact, so I called it that. But I just want to make clear about the distinction between what royalty in France thought and what the people on the ground here. So let's get started. I have dates there for a reason. So I wanted to put this map up because before I start talking about things, we have to get away from a North American point of view, like a modern point of view of how we get to Thunder Bay and how we get across Canada. So it's very, very important to know where the water goes, because those were the roots of the First Nations that were here. So Thunder Bay is right here, and there's Lake Nipigon, conveniently located up there. So all the water in here goes out to the Atlantic, and we know that the St. Lawrence is the basin by which the French accessed North America. So that's important to know, and it's a very important reason why there was a fur trading post set up at the mouth of Lake Kamanistiquia, or the Kamanistiquia River. All the water here flows to Hudson's Bay. So you understand that we don't have to leave Thunder Bay very far before the water starts flowing to Hudson's Bay. And all the water here all ends up in Louisiana. So it's a whole Mississippi with all the waters that drain in it. And for a long time, as a historian, or as a young historian back in high school days, I couldn't understand why the English were so powerful with this little bit of land, whereas the French had this and all of this, which they never really had. They just traveled it because it was convenient. Once you get over a little portaging here, you get all the way down here. So I'm going to try to restrict my talk to this little area here, which is Thunder Bay now. And it still doesn't have a French name yet, but it was important to know that because of the way the waters drain, explain why Fort Kamanistiquia was a strategic place. It's all about water and where it goes. Okay, next slide, please. At the same time, I talked about the Ojibway. So it's important to note that the French never used the word Ojibway. They called them the Outaouais, or the Ottawa. But then they called everybody west of the Hurons, other than the Sioux Nation, and further south. So the Illinois were here, the Sioux were over here, but all of the First Nations along here, beyond the Hurons, they just called the Ottawas. That's just the word they use. So in all the contracts that I transcribe, the word they use is Outaouais, and there's two little number 8s in there. And that's how they rendered the pronunciation of the word. They had a hard time with that word, but they never used the word Ojibway. And just like, and now both French and English have to correct when we use the word Mohawk. Okay, the French use the word agné, and both languages now have to use Haudenosaunee, and I don't even know how to say it in French. So it just shows how our knowledge, we're still evolving in terms of knowing what our European ancestors encountered a long time ago. So I wanted to show this because the Ojibway were mostly here at the beginning of the period I'm talking about, and eventually were migrating. During that whole time I'm talking about, they were migrating west on both the north and south shore of the Lake Superior. Now, I just wanted that so that we know that that's who the French are dealing with when we're talking Thunder Bay. And and from what I gather, I'm not an expert on First Nations, but they were a powerful nation. So there was something I read from the Ojibway point of view where they won some major battle against the Haudenosaunee close to Peterborough towards the end of First Nations hostilities. They kept up with the Sioux, who I know from history were a powerful nation, and the Ojibway were just as powerful. So I'm just aware that they were power players. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. All right, so the French period starts basically the business with Fort Kamanistiquia with this person here, Pierre Esprit Radisson, and his cousin Médard Chouard de Groseilliers. I grew up in a French not in a French family, we're bilingual, but I knew all about these people because there were TV series in French about these folks. I had no idea that they ended up were crucial to the founding of the Hudson's Bay Company. But anyway, we'll get there. So what happened is, how many people don't know anything about these two characters? Okay, so they were, he was not a nobleman, but he was a very competent young man who eventually was captured by Mohawks in New York and spent some time with them and got to learn their ways and then managed to escape. So he was completely familiar with at least the First Nations. When they took you as a prisoner, if you were useful and you were intelligent, well, then they could use you, and after a while they'd come to trust you. But eventually he escaped, so he was quite comfortable in the ways of the forest. And his cousin, I'm not too sure about his whole story. Those who wish to read a good book, very readable, it's called The Bush Runner. And I'm not going to say it's academic historical treatise, but it's a fun book to read, and it gives you a good sense of who these people were. They came up in this area to get furs without a mandate to do so. So you understand that the whole French trading regime is very top-down, and you needed to have licenses to collect furs, but these folks thought they'd hit a gold mine up here. And at that point, Radisson, he's the one who tends to be the brains behind the operation, realized something about the drainage patterns, that once you get past Lake Superior, the water's heading back to Montreal, but when you get a little bit further west or north, the water's headed north. So he and his partner picked up a load of furs, came back to Montreal expecting to make a fortune. It was declared that their shipment was illegal. It was confiscated. He may have even been thrown in jail for a while. And he was some upset about this. So the short story is he left New France and he went and met British merchants in London to convince them that if they wanted to set up shop along Hudson's Bay, there was a lot of money to be made on furs from the northwestern end of Ontario and the west, although he knew nothing about how far that went, but that there were lots of rivers going to Hudson's Bay and that the British could make money there. And we'll be very clear about the whole purpose of, I won't call it exploration, but of business expansion is business. I grew up in a French Catholic school where it was all about the church and about saving souls and about establishing culture and dealing with savages and just improving life in North America. And now at close to 75 years old, I'm realizing that it was just business. There wasn't a lot of religion involved with this, not at where we are here at Fort Kamanistiquia. There was in the Huron country. And the same author that wrote Bush Runner has also written Crosses in the Sky. It's all about Jean de Brébeuf, the Canadian martyr. So, when we start to read about what actually happened and when we look at all the sources, including the First Nation sources, we get a more balanced view as to what actually happened. But in our case, it's very clear it's business. It's chasing furs. So these people, that's why I picked 1660, is as of this expedition, that meant that people in England were interested in furs and accessing them from Hudson's Bay. Next slide. Ah, look at that. I even put the crest on. I'm not an expert at technology, but I did my best. Okay, so they established their first post at Moose Factory in 1670. Next slide, please. Daniel Greysolon dit Duluth. So you're familiar with the city of Duluth? So they named their city after his name, but he's not related to founding it. He spent some time in the Lac des Mille Lacs in Minnesota. There is such a place, Lac des Mille Lacs, that's how you say it. And that's not the one in Ontario, it's the one down there. He spent a lot of time there. After having traded for furs amongst the Sioux and the Ojibway for several years, established 2 fur trading posts in 1684 and 1685. One was at the mouth of the Kamanistiquia River, and the other on the north shore of Lake Nipigon. Now, the reason I talked about the drainage before is when I started to realize more about this man, and I thought, okay, well, Lake Nipigon, then that means the post would be somewhere around Nipigon. I didn't know anything about drainage patterns. The French wanted their post way up the north end of Lake Nipigon because just past there is where the drainage goes north. So if you don't go there for the furs, the First Nations are taking them downriver to Hudson's Bay. So that post has not stood the test of time. Apparently, it's under 20 feet of water, and it's a geological, the people who look for things. Not an archaeologist, no, for money. Not a surveyor. Well, he's a geologist, but he's also the guys who look for, they don't pan, but they can find sites. Or a prospector, thank you. And I apologize, at my age, there are some words escape me, so I ask for help. I'm very humble that way. So he says he knows where it was. It's at the northeast end. There's a river that comes into Lake Nipigon, and it's under 20 feet of water right now. So those are the 2 French posts that get established, and that's the beginning of a French establishment here at the mouth of the Kamanistiquia River. Next slide, please. So I just want to show you this. So this is Lake Superior. It's not a nice blue, but here's Lake Superior. Here's Ile Royale. And here's the mouth of the Kamanistiquia River. Right here. It might not be. Yeah, here's the Sleeping Giant. And then Pie Island. So here's the mouth of the Kamanistiquia River. And the Ojibway and other First Nations had 2 routes that they used frequently. And one is you go back up the Kamanistiquia River to Dog's Lake. You go to the northwestern end of Dog's Lake, and there's a river that comes in here. I don't know, is it still called Dog River up there? Whatever. And then it's a swampy area, but at some point, if we had Highway 17, well, we would cross Highway 17. And I know I've got note at that spot where you can see the little creek that used to be called, well, it's still called the Savannah River, but it's just a creek at that stage. And then you head down a chain of lakes and you get this way. I think it's, is this Rainy Lake? And then you start heading, in French, it's Lac de la Pluie. And then you start heading west towards Winnipeg. And the other route that the French didn't know about at the beginning, now, I have to laugh at this. This is a Pigeon River, but on this map, I mean, the Pigeon River is never this straight. So that's the Grand Portage Trail. The Pigeon River is this kind of thing with waterfalls and all squiggly over here, and Grand Portage would be the walk. And in reflecting afterwards, I don't think anybody ever carried a canoe across there. Because I thought, it makes no sense to carry a canoe to Lake Superior. Nobody canoes Lake Superior. You can canoe along the shore, but you're not going anywhere. So if there were goods, and I can't prove this, but if French were bringing goods when they eventually ended up here, well, then they carried them over to here, and then they took canoes to take them back up. And the same with the First Nations, that they were bringing furs down. Well, they're not going to carry their canoes all the way to Lake Superior. It doesn't make sense. And if you ever get a chance to walk the path, you'll see it's an easy path to walk. It's long by our standards, but it's a nice, easy path. So the French weren't aware of this route in the beginning. They became aware later, but this is why Fort Kamanistiquia was here. Okay? And the other post was way up here somewhere so that they could go to get the furs and the First Nations and compete with the British coming in off of Hudson's Bay. And you saw the time lapse. So 1670 is when the Hudson's Bay posts start to get created, and the French are deciding to set up fur trading posts here. Did I say 1684 and 1685? Okay. Next slide, please. And in Thunder Bay, and I don't know if anyone knows exactly where the French posts were. Apparently there were two. There was one at one time, and then it was let go. We'll hear about that later. And then there was another one. But I would guess right here, this is the East End. That's what you call that part of town. And here's, is this Pacific where you go over the tracks? So I assume the post was somewhere here. It's not far inland, because in the beginning, they're just coming with goods here. The trading happens here. The furs are coming to them. Over time, people will move further west, but at the beginning, the time we're talking about, the furs come here. The French aren't paddling up the river. It's bad enough. And from what I could see of the contracts, they had a year. So they would leave Montreal in the summer, they would winter here, and then bring the furs back down the next year. The contracts all talk about folks leaving in June, July, and the date specified to come back. I've looked at about 3 or 4 of them now. They have to be back in Montreal for the next year, or they're expected back with the furs the following year. So this is where, and now right in this area, right about here, you'll see the following plaque. Next slide. And how many people have seen this? Okay, well, there you go. Good. It took me about 3 years to find it when I first moved here, but I finally found it. And then you can see the mentality. So I don't think the Ojibway are mentioned anywhere on here. And then we start off in 1612 with the Merchants of London Company formed. Well, who cares? Now, they're important in that that's who formed the Hudson's Bay Company, but what does that have to do with the place here? So, even the 100 associates. And then down here, I go down a little further, but they've got the Brothers Duluth, and now they have La Fourette. Well, it's not La Fourette, it's La Tourette. But that's okay. Transcription's not an easy art, and it's easy to mistake an F for a T. I had an Irish ancestor whose name I thought was Hoare, H-O-A-R-E. Turns out it was Sloane, S-L-O-A-N-E, because the H and the S-L, when you do it cursive, the way they did it then, easy to mistake them. You should have seen the name McNeely. It was butchered even worse. So anyway, this is a nice plaque to have. The location is terrible, and it's unfortunate because there's a lot of information here. And perhaps it could be left the way it is and maybe have a smaller plaque, maybe making certain corrections, maybe acknowledging that the whole time the people who helped cure the fur traders were First Nations. And in one of the books I've read, I have 2 books, they're both in French, where they do an analysis, a fairly modern analysis of the interaction between the fur traders and the First Nations, is that the fur traders would much rather rely on native medicine than European medicine, because all the Europeans did at that time was bleed you, apparently. Okay, so we'll continue. So, Daniel Grésalon appointed his younger brother, Claude Grésalon, Sieur de la Tourette, to manage both posts. So Daniel was the big cheese, and Claude looked after here and the post at Lake Nipigon. So because I do all this work in my own line, and the platform I use is Ancestry. There are many platforms, but I use Ancestry because for my work, they have a lot of the data banks that I need, particularly for French Quebec. So at one point, I just decided with Ancestry, when you're looking for someone, you can also, they have a listing where you can pull out indexes of notarial acts. So all of these voyageurs signed a contract. They all follow the same format. It tells you how much credit they had in goods and what they were expected to return in furs, and that their expenses would be paid, and the date that they should get back. So I just typed in Grésalon, And that's where I found a whole pile of contracts. You'll see a list of them. You won't be able to read them, but I have a sheet here. I'll just read off some names. That's all it's for. It's just to let you know that right now I'm up to about 50, 60 contracts with this name. Not Daniel, but Claude, who was managing the two posts. Now, it doesn't say they went to Fort Kamanistiquia. It doesn't say they went to Lake Nipigon. They just say in the Ottawa country, in French. But we know that's the two posts he managed. That's where these two were active. And before I forget, both brothers made a ton of money. Daniel died in Montreal of old age, of gout, I think. And his younger brother, Claude, went back to France and bought himself a small chateau. So they were here for a period of time. We'll talk a little bit more about them. But it's just to let you know that they were the first to sort of have an official status up here as official fur traders. Now, when I share this information, this is what's known. We have no idea about the people who did contraband. So there could be lots of people up here that were involved with the fur trade that we'll never know anything about unless their descendants come and tell us through oral history how they got to be their descendants. Okay, next slide, please. The Graiselon brothers were supported by two French governors who, of course, would receive kickbacks from the export of furs. So Joseph-Antoine Lefebvre de Labarre and Jacques-René de Brisé, Marquis de Denonville. This fellow particularly, I was lucky. I was in Montreal doing my own work, and I thought, well, why don't I see what they've got on him? And they have a book with all of his letters. So someone published a book for, I guess, university or whatever. But anyway, all of his correspondence is already, laid out in the book. So I could read all about his interactions with the Duluth brothers and how he would undercut the former governor and how governors didn't like him. And he always had to argue with the intendant. So it's fascinating. It's in French, but it's fascinating reading. And it's just interesting that all of his letters are there. And sometimes through important people, we find out about people down the chain. Okay, next slide. The Graiselon brothers also needed the backing of a rich merchant, in their case, Charles Aubert de Lachenay. Now, Lachenay was a merchant in Montreal for 40 years and had a deep understanding of the First Nations. So he's a respectable source when he writes different things about his experiences at that time. And he operated out of Montreal. So all of the contracts that we have, we'll talk about the people who signed the contract who are going to do the work and about the merchant who's supplying them the credit. We don't ever hear about how the governors get their money or what trickles back to France. That's a whole other story that's done over in France. Okay. Next slide. Now well, that's better than the other day. Okay, I can actually read those. Oh, thank you. So these are contracts that I found through Ancestry. So I started 16, I made the list. And the notaries are here. These are the names of the notaries. This is a notary I work a lot with for my ancestors, so it helps to get to know a notary's writing because they're not easy to read. So I'll just give off, these are the people who are the fur traders, and this is just the number of the contract. See this one here, it's disappeared, so it's there, but they don't have a copy of it. And I started to do this because I was starting to get curious. If these voyageurs are coming up, and I know we have a gap in our Canadian history, so when I read the textbooks and everything else, we have the fur trade, and then there's the conquest, the French-English battle. And then we get into Canada at some point, and then all of a sudden, we encounter the Métis in Manitoba. Like they're there. They just appeared out of nowhere. And I'm sitting back here saying, well, in the whole time period I'm talking about, there's not one French woman ever set foot at Fort Kamanistiquia. It's only a man's history. Well, if I'm wintering here, there's got to be some. I'll ask the questions later. So did any of these people leave a trace? And if it's not a legitimate trace, well, we'll never know. But if it is a legitimate trace, the one thing about Roman Catholics, there's the faith, but then there's the superstition. And what is it? One of my Roman Catholic friends said is that you have to get your shots when you're a Roman Catholic. So you get baptized, you get married in the church, and you get the extreme unction when you die. The rest, well, if you're out in the bush, well, you can't do it. So if they did have legitimate relationships with First Nations women, well, then they would probably at some point get the children baptized. and maybe it would happen later. They would establish a relationship. And I always grew up with a myth that the First Nations didn't have moral ethics. Well, I've learned from the 2 books I've just finished reading that they had strict moral ethics. If a white voyageur stepped out of line, he died. There was no court. He just died. In the morning, they'd find him with his head smashed in. And there was no discussion around. He transgressed his rights as a male with their women. Now, the one thing I have learned is that young First Nations women had much more freedom than European women until they married, so that they could sample the field, and that was acceptable in their culture. And when young voyageurs showed up, and they would be hardy, they would be strong, they could be sampled too. But there was a question that there might be a sampling, but at some point, if you're going to stay with someone, then there's going to be a relationship, and you're going to follow the code, in this case of the Ojibway. And they did have a code. I'm not a specialist in it, but they did have a code, so that the men who did stay, and if there are experts here, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the Ojibway had a sense of what Métis was. I think the First Nations had a deal where if you decided to join them, then you became part of them, and if you respect their code, well, you were just adopted. They did that amongst other First Nations. I know there's a lot of that. So the Europeans had that issue, is that if you created an offspring that was European and First Nations, that's métissage, like that's the term the French use, so that was a Métis. So the Europeans had that concept, and the missionaries certainly had that concept. So in one of the voyageur books I finished reading, they said we have to remove the lens of the missionaries and the people in authority, and they did their best to get as much. There were a few voyageurs that were literate, and they tried to assess what was going on and how that all worked. So up here, I did a little bit of work on this, but I have much more things to do with my own family history. But this would be great if Lakehead University, the University of Manitoba, the University of Montreal, and the University of St. Paul, Minneapolis got together and said, let's figure out what happened here. So then you search all of these people and find out that they all go back to Montreal when they were done. So over here, I did a few. In 1695, this Jean Dany, who was on a 1685 expedition. So in 1695, he was back in Montreal. I searched to see, yep, he's back in Montreal. So he didn't stay up here. Louis Urtubise in 1685, okay? He was, and I know he's back in 1688. So, you know, they came, they went. If something happened, nobody's ever going to find out about it. So on Sunday, there was a person here who was a descendant of the second page. Now, I know my second shot isn't as good, but it's just to let you know these are the names. And I have a list here if anyone's interested in names, but they're all French names. Pierre Nollan, Jean Leroy, Pierre Nollan, Jacques Barrette, Claude Guichard, Jacques Gay, Glory, Jacques Laval, Dazé, Volant Frère, Guillaume Marion. So they're people that existed. And in the voyageur book I read, they said there were people who just decided that that was going to be their life, and there were people that, you know, you made a bit of money and then you settled down and ran your farm and got married. So I don't know what the deal was with these people, but they all came to either the post at north of Lake Nipigon or to the post here at the Kamanistiquia River. Okay, next slide. It's not as good as this, but oh, look. How did you do that? Talk to Marcus. Okay, he ran the slides on Sunday. I couldn't read these names. So it was interesting. There was a person here who's a descendant of this guy, Pierre Cadieux. So, you know, it's not written on this list, but I put it on my little list. Okay, Cadieux didn't stay up here. He didn't end up becoming, living up here. He went back to Montreal. And it was interesting that that person was interested in her ancestor. So, and then someone says that I should go to La Vérendrye and do a presentation of the grade 12 class. And I said, well, if I do that, you know, do you have any students whose names, even if they're not descendants of these guys, who match? And one guy said, yeah, he has a Urtubise in his class. So it's just interesting if a kid's last name is this. I don't know if you're related to him, but here's a guy who was up here a long time before you were. So those are lists. Now, I have an odd one down here. This has nothing to do with the Grésalon brothers, but we'll talk. Oh, yes, it is. Du lieu à Monsieur l'auteur. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so this is just a list of voyageurs who we'd want to study to see, did any of them stay? Okay, next slide. Who were these men? Did any eventually stay and join in Ojibway life as members of the community? Is this the beginning of Métis? What is the Ojibway side of the story? And that's where I'm realizing that, I have no idea. I saw a website that purports to be from the Ojibway Nation, and I read some of that at one point. And I've been told that here at Thunder Bay that things went off the rails when the Northwest Company took over, and that there was a whole change in the mix of things. And then someone else told me, well, you'll probably be able to get some information if you go to Atikokan, because that whole move of the Ojibway Nation west, it seems that people there were more sheltered from whatever happened after this period. So if any of you have insights into someone in the Ojibway First Nation that I could talk to, I would like to sit down, because I'm aware when I look at the last names of Fort William First Nation, there are a lot of French names there. And I did some hiking in the Nipigon area, and I forget what the First Nation is there, but it's just off the bridge, just to the left. No, not Red. It's on the left. Or is that Red Rock? They have a name. St. Helen? Okay. So I think one of the names I see there is Villeneuve. Could be. Anyway, I just know that there's a lot of French last names. And I'm saying, so if I were to do some ancestry search, like, was any of that connected to this? Or when did that, or did it come later? And I'll talk about that after. Okay, next slide. Back to here, 1710 to 1717, it's a decline of importance and activity at Fort Kamanistiquia. They'd already made the move to Grand Portage, because it's easier to walk that hike across that nice path in the bush than it is to go up the falls at Kakabeka. And 1717, it's a reestablishment of Fort Kamanistiquia under Zachary Robutel de Lanoux, who was supplied by Jean-Baptiste Charly, Montreal merchant, and Governor Philippe de Rigaud de Vaudreuil. Well, I don't know if you know much about Eastern Ontario, but just when you leave Eastern Ontario, well, you come into Vaudreuil, and there's a town of Rigaud. So we know where the names came from. Okay, so it was kind of let go, and if, I'm not sure exactly where we're situated, but from the front door of the museum here, you can look across, there's a plaque at City Hall. It says Fort Kamanistiquia, and they commemorate this guy coming in 1717. And I have his contract. So I will pass it around now so that I don't forget about it. Now what I've done is you'll see the original contract, you'll see the transcription, and I follow the rules, the transcription rules of la Société Canadienne-française, la Société généalogique Canadienne-française de Montréal. So they have rules. Different groups have rules for doing transcriptions. They don't all agree with each other, but I'm following their rules because that's where I was trained. So you'll see that on the typewritten side, there's numbers on the left. Well, they didn't exist. You'll see the original manuscript on the left, the typewritten so the French person could read it, and I've translated on the back, not word for word, but I've translated a summary. So we'll just read the summary at the end. Now, I didn't think it was going to cost me that much to have these things made up, because I did it newspaper format, so you can open up and it looks really nice. If you wish to keep that copy, then you must give me $3. However, if you don't want the copy, once you're done with it, just leave them at the back. If you want the information, I can send you that by text or email free of charge. Okay, if you want the original transcription and the original copy and the French transcription, I have those. But, I thought, well, I'm not paying $60 anyway. And I apologize to the people on Zoom. But if anyone who's on Zoom would like a copy of these, just ask Scott and send your email address, and I'll make sure I send you what folks are going to be looking at here. And what's nice about doing genealogy, I used to have to go and photocopy in Montreal, and I could not get over to France. I couldn't afford that, although I have taken family groups to France for genealogical tours. Everything's online now. Like I was going through records last night looking for someone in the 1600s in a little place called Saint-Saëns, which is not far from Dijon in France. And I'm looking at the original baptismal certificates. So this is the same. These documents we can get online through My Family search, or you can go directly to the archives in Quebec. And if you know how to get through, then you can download them. And I just have them done that way to my place. And then I start transcribing. I just sit down and I'm working on the one. I told you there was a descendant here of a fur trader. And it's not being easy. I'm working at it right now. It's a one-pager like this one. So if you look on the back of the sheet, gives you an idea of the contract. So what I've done is I haven't put in all the legal jargon. I've basically summarized it. So you see that it's two people. So this guy that's on the plaque, he signed this contract in 1717, and then he came up here to reestablish the post. And did I give the amount? How much did he have in merchandise? How much? 1,500, and they use livres, pounds, like French pounds, and he was to come back with how much in furs? 17. So, you know, they're going to make 200 livre profit on this, on whatever he had. So I was surprised that, you know, I'm seeing this guy who's coming to reestablish the post, and I'm thinking he'll bring a whole flotilla. It's just him and one other guy in a canoe with a bunch of goods, and they're coming to restore the fort. So, and it didn't indicate anyone else. I thought there'd be more. Now, you saw in my last, in the other, the long list of contracts, you know, there's flotillas coming up. Okay. All right. And paleography is what I do 8 times a year. So I take a French document and I work it through. And this has nothing to do with Fort Kamanistiquia, but I thought I'd share it with you. Is that a descendant like myself from Montreal found a deed to a piece of land in Annapolis Royal, which was then Port Royal. And they're very hard to come by because most of everything was destroyed in Port Royal between the English and the French, the Acadians. But he found a deed in France. And it's not a deed because in the seigneurial system, you don't actually own the land, but you have the right to it. And it's from 1692. And it's written in France because there's no notaries in Port Royal. And he was just lucky to get it. So those are the finds that you hope to find when you're doing this thing. And I'll share this that has a lot to do with up here. Is there's a gentleman here, Mr. Wilson. Where are you? Where are you? Where's Mr. Wilson? He was here. Oh, there, right here. Sorry. I lost you in the crowd there. So he's showing up with a whole bunch of artifacts that he's found on the portage routes in this area. So those who are interested, he was showing me at the beginning. Those who are interested after, you know, whatever I have to say, you'll have heard. If there's anything else you want to talk about, I'm happy to talk about anything. But he's got some real neat artifacts that I've never seen before, and they're from up here, and they're blades from tools. They're beads that date back to a certain time. So he's got all kinds, and there's an item he's not sure what it is. And I promised him when I go back to Montreal, I'll go to the library, and there's a big encyclopedia of old tools, and I'll find out what it is. I'll find a picture of it. I can memorize what it is and let him know what it means. Okay, next slide. 1717 to 1759, Fort Kamanistiquia established as a garrison fort. So now we don't just have voyageurs coming up, but we have some soldiers coming up to stay here for a while. As no French women ever resided there, what are the relationships between the soldiers, the voyageurs, and the First Nations? So now you've got men sitting up here like for longer than a year, and I know I've seen contracts that go over 3 years. So, and there's no record of a French woman being up here. So we're saying in that time, there's got to be some relationships setting up that are going to last for a period of time. And it would be interesting, we'd have to go through all the people that came up here to find out, did any of them stay? Is there a link with some of the names, family names at Fort William? Well, the good one is, how many people know where Pays Plat is? And how many people know that that's Pays Plat, flat land? Okay, that's the French name, Pays Plat. Well, that name has to come from the French period. The Ojibway didn't name it that. So, and I don't know if there's some last names that are French. And I know you have to be careful with last names, because for a while I was wondering, well, you have a Mount McKay here. When are they going to change it to the Ojibway name? And a bunch of people told me, well, McKay is an Ojibway name, so don't get into the family politics over at Fort William. Next slide, please. 1730 to 1780, extensive Ojibway migration from the eastern section of both north and south shores of Lake Superior to the western, south, and north shores of same. So I referred to that earlier. We'll just skip that. 1720 to 1744, Fort Kamanistiquia was the launching pad for the expeditions of Pierre Gauthier de Varennes, Sieur de la Vérendrye. So at least the French board knew what they were doing when they called their high school here. Well, everybody calls it Lave, but it's La Vérendrye, okay? At least it's well named after someone that spent some time up here, who established a string of trading posts all the way to Lake Winnipeg in order to compete with the English-based along Hudson's Bay. Still no French women ever come this way. So he's not your typical businessman. Actually, he was awful as a businessman. He was really keen on exploration, but his purpose to being here was to compete with the Hudson's Bay Company. And now the French are having to go further west, because the First Nations are saying, listen, we can easily go downriver and take our furs to the English. If you want our furs, come and get them. So this is where you've got French voyageurs now going further west. And now there has to be some beginning of the Métis Nation. Like, it doesn't just happen. It's all related to this route. And it may have already have started happening, but I don't know much about that in-between period. Next slide, please. This was a nice map that I thought I'd show you because it shows the two routes again. Here's Lake Superior. This is a more modern map. But here again, you see there's the Sleeping Giant. And here's the Kamanistiquia River. And people go up here to Dog's Lake. Ignore this. That's more to do with the Dawson Road. They go up here to Dog's Lake and then go through the swamp at the northeast end, eventually catch onto the Savane River, and then head all the way down here and head west. And the other route, this is a little better here. You can see here's the Pigeon River. And now at least they have this snaky, awful thing over here with waterfalls and shallow water. But now you have this nice sidewalk through the bush called Grand Portage. And that was the main route. And I know that La Vérendrye used both. He started at Fort Kamanistiquia, but he also used this one, depending on which was easier. And he had some sons involved. And one of those sons eventually made it to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. But in terms of a business, it wasn't much of a business. La Vérendrye was not a good businessman. Okay, next slide. The French garrison left Fort Kamanistiquia in 1759 to fight the English invasion at Quebec. They never returned. Which French still remained? And who were the first Métis to be recognized as such before the arrival of the Northwest Company? So I'm not sure what your knowledge is of the transition. I'd like to know more about what happened in Montreal. So you have this whole voyageur machinery in place, and we must assume that some of those voyageurs are parked. We find out with the Northwest Company that they talk about winterers, and what is it? Le Canot du Nord, the northern canoe. Anyway, there's the pork eaters and there's the winterers. Well, that comes later. I'm not sure that existed in the French time, but basically a bunch of Scotsmen arrived. First off, the Hudson's Bay Company thought it would have it all. They've eliminated the French, so we just sit back along the shores of Hudson's Bay and the furs come to us. But a bunch of enterprising Scots, and I don't know their whole history, realized that there was money to be made, that there was a system in place. I don't know if there were a couple of French-Canadian businessmen who said, listen, have I got a deal for you? I know stuff. And they eventually took over the business. So there's a company called the XY Company, and then there's a Northwest Company. And they basically take over. It's not pretty, the takeover. It's capitalism at its best. And there's all kinds of people coming up from Albany and other places in the States also trying to cash in on this. But anyway, they take control and they become rivals to the Hudson's Bay Company, just like the French had been before. And for those of you who know I think there was a TV series not too long ago. It was a bitter rivalry and violent. And at one point, the Hudson's Bay Company finally took them over as a business decision. I think it was 1824 that the Hudson's Bay Company took over. Did I have the right year? 1821. Okay, they basically merged, and then there's no more competition. But my point was just to tell you about the French time, and I think that is my last slide. The one in French is more dramatic. I had it all in black and white, and it looked gruesome. So that's all I wanted to share with you tonight. I hope some of it made sense and held together. I know sometimes people take questions, but I mean, maybe those who want to ask questions just want to ask me after. Anyway, if there's a question you think everybody wants to know an answer to, if there's a correction that should be made, I'd be glad to listen. And yes, sir. I don't know. I'm not sure. I know they were migrating, but I don't know enough of my history myself. So, and that when I mentioned earlier that I would love to sit down with an elder, and I've read that in several places. Now, one of the versions, and it's just a version, is that it's a little bit like the BC nations up to the north, is that the Ojibway knew what was coming in the sense of European expansion, because they were dealing both with English and with French. So I have a sense that they were moving to, somebody had a vision that they needed to move to another area and that they'd be safer there. But that is not, that's just something I read someplace. I can't even quote where. But I would love to sit down with an elder sometime, if that could happen. And I'm sure they're there. Are you all familiar with Roots, the TV series and the author? And then I read the book after. The epilogue was fascinating because he went back to Africa. His name was Alex Haley, right? He went back to Africa and got close. He had a guide, got close to where he thought his ancestors came from. And wherever his family had come from, still maintain the traditions, and they have oral historians that are still there. And in the epilogue to his book, and I was a little bit teary-eyed when I read it, is that he encountered one of these wise men who, through an interpreter, guided him back to the village, and he remembered the story as to what had happened and when that family had left. And like, you can't ask for any more savage, well, other than what's going on in the world today. So I don't know why. I just am aware that there's some of the history books there have talked about it, that and everyone knows why there were so many First Nations around Sault Ste. Marie. It's the same reason as today. It's full of fish. So it's just teeming with fish. So First Nations, many First Nations would often either, I don't know if it's summer or winter, they would be there fishing. And there is a nation that the French do mention, and they call them les sauteux, which in English means the jumpers, but that's because of the falls. The Sault, like when you say Sault Ste. Marie in French, the word is saut, which means a waterfall or a rapids. So the French did call the First Nations there the sauteux, but I'm not sure if they were different than Ojibway or if they were just a faction. But all I know is that from what I've read, the little bit I've read, is that they were on their way west during that same time period. Okay? Yes? Okay, so the Cree are along Hudson's Bay at all the way west. So you have the Plains Cree, and then I'm not sure, do we say the Northern Cree? Because you also have the Cree in Quebec. Okay, and I'm not an expert with that, but I know that the French were aware of the Cree, and the interesting thing in Quebec is that the Cree all speak English because they were dealing with the Hudson's Bay Company. They weren't dealing with the French, like with the French fur traders. So that's an explanation why relations in Quebec between the Cree and the Quebec government aren't always harmonious. Yes? Probably not. I don't know about Fond du Lac, but probably not Michipicoten, because they got right stop here, and Daniel Grezalon did a lot of his negotiating between the Sioux and the Ojibway in order to keep some kind of harmony so he could trade with them both. So most of what I've read is his activity was in the Minnesota area, and his brother was Fort Kamanistiquia and Lake Nipigon, and they weren't here long. They were just here long enough to make money and then leave. Which, in Canada, I think you're aware that anyone who's not a soldier, but who has any rank in the military, anyone who's a leader like Zachary Robutel, he's an aristocrat. And did anybody see the ad in the paper about this? Nobody asked me a question. Oh, okay. One of the maps I showed here was Oshaga's map. I didn't know that at the time, and I apologize for not putting the credits on. As far as I know, he was Ojibway, but I can't guarantee that. On who? Oh, well, okay. So yes, I can speak because I have a personal connection. And it's a sweet little story because it involves one of my grandsons. Imagine that. No, I don't travel through time. Zachary Robutel, it's on the plaque up here, and I didn't discover this. Another Boyer far-off cousin did, and he asked me, was I aware that there was a connection? I said, no. So I went and checked. So the Zachary Robutel here is called Zachary Robutel de Lanoux. His father was Claude Robutel de Saint-André. Claude Robutel is an aristocrat who was part of the founders of Montreal, who brought two of my ancestors, my original Boyer ancestors, to Canada. He first brought a woman called Marguerite Maclean, who was about 11 or 12 years old, and he brought her over with Marguerite Bourgeois, who's a famous French name, who brought over a bunch of girls, and one of them was this little Marguerite Maclean. And then a little later, this Zachary Robutel hired my ancestor, Nicolas Boyer, on a 3-year contract to come and work in Montreal as a carpenter. So Marguerite married someone, and he was a scalping survivor. So when I visited some people in France, I said, whoa, he said he must have been something to look at because it means he lost part of his scalp, but he survived. So anyway, that was Marguerite's first husband. They had 2 kids and he died. And Nicolas Boyer, my ancestor, married her in Montreal. And they decided that Zachary Robutel, the one who ended up here, would be the godparent of one of their children. So they called their son Zachary Boyer, named after Zachary Robutel that's here. So I told my son this story, and he named his little boy Zachary Boyer. So after this little historical tale. So it's sweet that my kids every now and again, I don't bore them to tears over this. None of them are here. They don't live here, but anyway, well, one of them does. It's just a sweet little story, but it's based on a piece of history that's kind of cute. So I don't know if that answered the story, but I know a lot about Zachary Robutel and the Robutel family. Yes. 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 Well, no, but that's the original Fort William. Oh yes, no, Fort Kamanistiquia never had stone, and it may have had a palisade when they decided to make it a type of fort, but I mean it was not grand. It's nowhere near what Fort William was. Okay, and you'll also see it written as Fort Kamanistiquia. You know, it's as best you can. They're using a First Nations word and using the French alphabet, and then someone interpreting what they heard. So no, that this fort, that when the French left, it was abandoned. And then when the Northwest Company came up, I think they built their own buildings. No, not all that long. When the Northwest or XY Company, the people from Montreal, when they took over, they were anxious to get up here because they were competing with the Hudson's Bay Company. And the furs were out west. And there were posts. So I was strictly restraining my talk here to Fort Kamanistiquia. But the French had forts at Rainy River. They had fur trading posts all the way out to Winnipeg and may even beyond. They may have already reached the Athabasca, but I'm not an expert. I'm not even an expert at this, but I know some stuff. And I tried to restrict it to just Fort Kamanistiquia. And then, although it's not part of tonight's topic, everyone's aware of where Fort William originally was, right? It was at Grand Portage. Okay, it wasn't here. Eh? Well, I don't know what it was called, but that was their main base. And then it's a political deal that they had to move back to here. Okay, so you're all aware of that. I don't need to cover that. If anyone wants to know that story, it's a cute story, but it's not the French period. I've made this confusing enough. Yes? Yes? No connection at all. Like Albany was an important, I don't know if Albany was originally Dutch, but anyway, it became English, and that was the main post for the English Haudenosaunee connection. And when I say Haudenosaunee, I mean Mohawk. Yes, Albany, New York. That was where the competition was coming from on the southern end of things. Okay. Well, okay. And so I've got no, but you've seen it, and you know where to find copies of that map. Okay. Well, then I have your email, right? Yes. I didn't have that before tonight. And by the way, I want to thank, like, both on Sunday and tonight. Like, it's not just me giving a presentation. I'm learning all kinds of stuff, which I appreciate. Scott. Okay, so we have some evidence, and my guess would be 1683 for the date, because I don't know that in 1679 the Duluth brothers were active. Now, again, maybe there was a post there that we don't know, but it wasn't an official one. Okay, well, thank you very much. You've been a very kind audience, and I hope I didn't keep you too long. And there are refreshments, coffee. I had some the other day. It was great. I had tea. I drank it by mistake, but there's tea and coffee and fruit. And they even are they little cinnamon rolls?
Yeah, I got some more words before we quit.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Gérard, I did have a gift for you I wanted to present to you before you make your escape.
I'm not leaving until everyone's gone.
Okay, good. So I do have a pen here from the Society that we wanted to give you for contributing to our lecture series.
Thank you.
Yeah, so one other thing I wanted to point out. So everyone saw that memorial tablet, and it said Thunder Bay Historical Society on it. I want to make sure I dispel a myth. While that it was our organization established in 1908, and that plaque or cenotaph there put in 1914, it's no longer ours. It belongs to the city of Thunder Bay. So if you see it or you have complaints about the condition of it or the flowers around it, don't call me. Call the city of Thunder Bay, because I get a couple times a year I have to kind of answer the mail on that. But anyway, As part of the closing, as you leave tonight, I do encourage you to visit our gift shop. And new this year, we also have a kiosk at Goods & Company. So as you're doing your holiday shopping and buying gifts for loved ones, do think of us and stop by that new shop over at Goods & Company that'll be there through the end of December. If you've enjoyed tonight's presentation or others like it, we do encourage you to become a member of the Society. It's $30 for individuals and $45 for families. So you can also do that at the front desk on your way out. Do look at our upcoming events calendar. For our next free public lectures on the 28th of January, Brian Wyatt will be talking about sports in Thunder Bay. On the 25th of February, we'll be hosting presentations from Lakehead University graduate students, topics and students to be determined. And then on the 25th of March, following our annual general meeting, David Roberts, the author of Boosters, Barkers, and Financing Canada's Involvement in the First World War, will be here giving a presentation. And also, we just secured the date. Our annual A Taste of History dinner will be on the 4th of April, all around the theme of the 150th anniversary of the first sod turning in Westfort for the Canadian Pacific Railway. So we'll be having a speaker on Northern Ontario Railways, and of course, we found an exciting menu from 1926 featuring CPR dining car foods. So should be a good evening, and yeah. So again, right before we close, thank you to Lakehead University's Department of History for sponsoring tonight's lecture. Thank you to our corporate members, Thunder Bay Pulp and Paper, Equipment World, Woodland Heritage Northwest, and of course, thank you to the museum's staff and volunteers who did all the setup and made tonight's event possible. So Sarah Silvestri back there on technology, Inslee staying late at the front desk, and of course, all the other staff and custodial team that took care of this room for today. Please do take advantage of the refreshments, as Gerard pointed out, and have a great rest of your night. Yes?
Just one look. Can I just?
Yeah.
I'm putting a little plug. I'm putting together a presentation on the story of Canadian ancestry, of Canadian descendants. So I won't mention who those descendants are. Okay, but just there's a bunch of people out there who come about Acadia. So because of the deportation of the Acadians, they're fascinating stories. I don't plan to do a whole picture. I'm taking an ancestry and tracing out for about 3 generations away from the person living here. So I'll do about 4. I'm going to generate a whole series because every one of these can be one of them might be more than 4 times. So I never have to figure out crazy what I thought it was fun. They got recorded over. So by doing one at a time, you get a fascinating look at what happens to a group of people that do a family thing. And 2 of the people that do it for didn't know anything else. The one person didn't know anything about it. He said, and the other fellow just didn't know what that type of family. He said, well, you have French, English, Nick, a lot of Canadian families that together like that. So they're fascinating stories. So I just want you to know that I'm going to put that together, and I usually do one in my videos. So we'll let you know when it is.
Thank you very much.